everyone, how are we all doing? My name is Kay and I'm Crafter with Kay, and welcome to my reading nook. We are doing really well with the Hellcat series so far. Big shout out and thank you to Sharon Hannaford again for allowing me this opportunity. It's a lot harder than it looks, but I am thoroughly enjoying it. We do have a finish. I'll put what I was working on over here somewhere. Curl up with a good book. It is now up on my wall. So that means we need another canvas to work on. So before I show you that, I just want to say a word of warning. I've been putting the warnings at the start of my videos and I hope to continue to do so. These books are for, I'd say, young adults onwards. So there is violent scenes, sexual natures, nothing too explicit, but there is still undertones and language, and yeah. So you are warned, it's not for under 18s, under 15s, 18s. Use your discretion. Viewer discretion is advised. So the next kit we are going to work on is from Diamond Art Studio by Eszter Anna, and it's Tame Your Fears, because this is just awesome. So I have unboxed this recently on my channel, but as you can see there is a woman grabbing the dragon, taming her fears. Nothing is impossible, as Cindy would say, but it's true. I just love all the colours, so you will be seeing this on a time lapse very soon. But I hope you all enjoy and continue to enjoy this series, and thank you for following me on this journey. So see you soon. Enjoy! Chapter 12. The phone buzzed annoyingly. Gabby cracked one eyelid open and groaned. She felt like she hadn't slept in a week. The morning sun was filtering through the cracks in her curtains and she could hear Rose humming to herself somewhere in the house. That meant it was already after 8:30. She could also hear the rush of water in the spare bathroom. Carl must be up and about. Trust him to be awake and chipper after the night they just had. The buzzing sounded again. Sighing, Gabby picked up to see who was calling. Byron, the caller ID flashed. She immediately hit the answer button. Hey, she greeted him groggily. Morning, sunshine, he teased her gently. Rose will be in a moment with a coffee. I called her before I woke you up. I hate waking you up after the night you had, but I knew you'd want the news as soon as possible. Gabby sat up in bed, tumbling Razor off to one side and making him grumble at her before yawning hugely and beginning his morning grooming. Before she could ask Byron what the news was, Rose tapped at the door and entered carrying a huge steaming mug of coffee. Gabby grinned at her gratefully. Rose, you're an angel. Thanks, she whispered, tucking the phone between her left shoulder and ear to take the giant mug with both hands and breathe in the heavenly scent of Ethiopian special blend. Rose gave her a fond but slightly worried smile. Breakfast will be ready in 20 minutes, she said sternly, bustling out the room, with Gabby's laundry basket under one arm. Gabby focused her attention back on what Byron was telling her as she sipped the hot coffee. The council has agreed to meet with Julius, Byron said. In fact, we're quite anxious to meet with him. The Mage High Council came back very promptly with some disturbing news about the Dark Mage, Mariska. They've been trying to track her down for some time now, and have spoken to the mages who were present with you last night. They were extremely concerned about the alliances she's made in the demon world. They're taking this every bit as seriously as Julius seems to be. Byron paused to take breath. We're mobilising everyone and calling in favours from other cities. We may need to fast-track a couple of hunter trainees. I've convinced the rest that if we can have a strong vampire clan working with us as well, it may make all the difference to how quickly we can eradicate this threat. And how many casualties we'll have, Gabby noted quietly, a small shiver going through her as she suddenly thought about Julius's vision. She shook off the dark, disturbing thought and put down the mug to get out of bed and throw on a robe. Where and when? She asked Byron. I need to let Julius know. She took down the details of the location for the meeting and said goodbye to Byron. Then she steeled herself for another long day. So much for Sunday being a day of rest. Gabby, dressed in comfy jeans and a rude t-shirt, pointedly ignoring the sling lying on her dresser. Her collarbone was stiff and uncomfortable, but not terribly painful today. Then she headed for her office. She wanted to make the call to Julius before she went for breakfast, even though the delicious smell of fresh pancakes was an almost physical pull to the kitchen. She powered up her computer as she put the call through to Julius. Carl appeared in the doorway wearing only a pair of jeans and looking sickeningly healthy. His damp dark blonde hair was standing in spiky disarray, and there were no signs of the deep gash in his scalp. She waved him in and turned on the speakerphone just as Julius answered in his distinctive velvet voice. "Gabrielle?" His voice was almost a purr, but Gabby thought she could detect a faint trace of weariness in it. "Did vampires get tired?" she wondered idly. "Morning, Jules," she drawled, only just suppressing a yawn. She heard him snort softly. "Is Carl all right this morning?" he asked, surprising both her and Kyle. She sighed. "Yeah, he's as healthy as a proverbial horse. He's just walked into my office so I can give you both the news and save repeating myself later." Julia stayed silent, so she went on. "Byron called me this morning to say the meeting has been arranged." She glared at her warningly when she used Byron's name. She waved him down. "They seem to have some information about the Dark Mage, which has made them sit up and take notice. Byron has suggested we use the conference room at the Riverview Hotel. Do you know it? The one that's owned by the Magi How Council?" "Yeah, there's safety measures already in place there, and the staff are used to catering to non-humans and turning a blind eye when they have to. Though we would understand if you feel uncomfortable with the venue, I'm sure something else could be arranged." She didn't want him backing out now. "No, I think it would be appropriate for the council to meet where they feel at ease, as long as I may bring a few of my own." "Yeah, I discussed that with Byron. He agreed that it was only fair. How many would you like to bring?" She was a little hesitant. She remembered very clearly the looks of fear and anxiety his guard had elicited when they arrived at the station last night. Some of the vampires were very imposing. She could hear the slight smile in his voice when he replied. "I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Alexander will insist on coming along, and I'm afraid he's not the best company when he feels I may be in danger, as you noticed at dinner last night, but I will keep him under control. I will need to introduce the council to Patrick, my daytime chief of security. He is a werewolf and integral part to my security force. And perhaps two of my personal guard, Nathan and Marcello, would probably be best. They are a little less intimidating than some of the others, unless you have another suggestion." "No, I think that will be fine," she said, fighting a grin as she thought of the suave Italian vampire charming all the Magus women. Nathan looked like the bodyguard he was, and she had no idea what to expect from Patrick, the security chief. But no one would begrudge Julius a little protection in a hotel full of other supernaturals. Alexander would be Alexander, no doubt. She remembered her last thought as she went to sleep earlier, and was wondering if the English vampire had multiple personality disorder. But in light of what Julius had said, perhaps it was just a defence mechanism. Regardless, if he chose to be charming tonight, the females in the meeting would stand no chance of resistance. They agreed on a time an hour after sunset and ended the call. Gabby quickly perused her email and then headed to the kitchen with Carl and filled him out on what he'd missed between mouthfuls of pancakes, fried bananas, bacon and syrup. After breakfast, Carl headed home and Gabby issued Rose out the door before she could find a reason to stay longer. Rose came in on a Sunday so that she could take a weekday off to mind some of the grandkids, but Gabby never let her work the full day, only letting her come in to do the basics and cook breakfast, then chasing her home to spend some time with her husband. Once Rose left, Gabby went into the bathroom and had a good look at the wound on her shoulder. She decided it was sufficiently healed to pull the stitches out and set to work with a small pair of scissors and a pair of tweezers. She winced as the threads pulled free of her flesh, talking to Slinky to distract herself from the disturbing task. As many times as she did this, it always gave her the creeps. When the stitches were out, she covered the wound with a waterproof wound plaster, reluctantly admitting to herself that Julius's pet doctor had done a good job with the stitching. Though a scar was still inevitable, she picked up Slinky and let him wind himself around her neck as she went back to her office to catch up on admin and emails. She needed to try and clear her diary for at least the next week or two. She had a feeling that things in the city were about to get nasty fast. When she heard Carl's van drive up late that afternoon, she was still yawning after catching a quick cat nap. As he let himself in, she was settling next into the sheath down her back, a half-eaten chocolate croissant in one hand and a cup of coffee on the counter next to her. "Here, let me hold that for you," Carl said, grabbing the croissant as he passed her on his way to the coffee maker in the kitchen. He promptly stuffed the remains of the croissant into his mouth as he reached for a coffee mug. He ducked the apple she threw at his head and caught it as it ricocheted off the cupboard, biting into it as he poured the coffee. Do you not have a kitchen in your own house? She grumbled, looking for something else to throw at him. Of course I do. It just isn't nearly as well stocked as yours. He threw her his trademark impish grin. Besides, I can smell the rest in the warmer, so you won't go hungry. I knew you were coming, so I had no choice but to warm up extras, she groused, elbowing him in the ribs with her good arm as she moved past him to pull the rest of the croissants out of the warmer. They quickly fueled up on coffee and carbs as Gabby filled Razor and Slinky's food bowls, and just after sunset they drove out in the Mustang. It was after midnight when the council session was finally called to a close. Gabby was ravenous. The lone lollipop she'd found in her jacket pocket was doing little to ward off the feeling that her stomach was trying to digest itself. The members of the council had seemed to drone on and on. There was a huge debate over every tiny detail that was brought up, Athena being her usual obnoxious self, but Julius had shown nothing but patient attentiveness throughout. She realised that he had probably explained the slightly deferential attitude the elders had shown him by the end. That and his charismatic personality, she reluctantly admitted to herself. He really could be quite compelling when he turned on the charm. He was dressed in black pants, a midnight blue cashmere sweater, and his black leather coat, his pale iridescent skin in stark contrast to the deep colours. The rest of his entourage were dressed almost completely in black, and had been largely silent throughout the meeting. Marcello and Nathan had stood inhumanly still at positions either side and slightly behind Julius. Alexander and Patrick had taken seats either side of him. Alexander in his typical James Dean slouch, belying his absolute attention to every movement in the room, and Patrick obvious in his scrutiny of everyone and everything. Patrick had proved to be a tall, dark-haired, muscular man with a short-cropped hair, a neatly trimmed moustache and goatee, and a posture that spoke of military background. Alexander had again begun the meeting with a belligerent attitude, but had mellowed towards the end. He'd even shown a degree of enthusiasm when discussing offensive tactics with Carl and Douglas, who was present in the capacity of the senior hunters. Alistair and Patrick seemed to know each other, by reputation at least, and there appeared to be a mutual respect between them, which was unusual in dominant werewolves, and said a great deal about their characters. Gabby had caught Patrick eyeballing Carl a number of times during the course of the evening, but Carl had refused to raise the bait, pretending ignorance of Patrick's attention. Carl had long since gotten used to the odd attention he drew from the rest of the werewolf fraternity. Carl and Gabby had been handed positions of liaison between the council and Julius's clan, as they had already established a relationship with the vampires, and Gabby had secretly both welcomed and dreaded the part she had been assigned, just as she was both attracted to and disturbed by being in Julius's presence. Gabby was relieved that Julius hadn't brought up his vision of her death at the meeting, but slightly annoyed with Margaret for bringing up her previous encounter with the Wraith. Gabby sighed. She was being unfair. The elderly shapeshifter had no way of knowing that Julius had been kept in the dark about the blindness. It really wasn't her fault, but the look that Julius had thrown her way at the time told Gabby she was going to be grilled about the incident as soon as they were alone. Julius had been open and candid with the council, answering questions unerringly, only pausing when anger overwhelmed him during their discussion of Dante and his motives. Athena had been openly antagonistic, trying to repeatedly trip him up by firing question after question at him until Irene had finally laid a reproving hand on her arm, reminding Athena of her manners. Athena had then lapsed into a hostile silence, and Gabby had found herself wondering what the witch was plotting. Irene's acceptance of his answers without extensive cross-examination meant that she felt he was being honest with them. If anyone would know, she would, and she was like a pit bull when it came to drawing out the truth from someone. Strangely, the topic of Julius's insider knowledge of the SMV was not brought up. Perhaps that was what Athena had been working up to. Gabby had vowed to get into the bottom of the mystery soon, but didn't want to bring it up with Athena around to cause dissent in the ranks. The information the council had been given about Mariska was informative, but not particularly useful. She was a powerful necromancer who had been orphaned at a young age and had been fostered by one of the Magi elders. She had been a problem child, and as hard as they tried to mould her to conform to the ethics of the Magi Council, she had always seemed to be on the edge of slipping to the dark side. It seemed all she needed was a tiny push in that direction, and she had gone rushing off down the dark path. They'd lost track of her several months ago and hadn't been able to find any trace of her since. They had several tracking spells that hadn't been tried, as they were very difficult to perform. But with the current news, a decision had been made to find her no matter the cost. The only bit of good news was that she hadn't been taught the dark spells, so she'd been muddling through things as best she could on her own. She was also relatively young, by Magus standards, and wouldn't have come into her full powers yet. She was at the top of the Magus Council's agenda, along with trying to find a way to destroy the Wraith. Gabby was more than happy to be leaving that in their hands. The less she had to do with that thing, the better. The Magus Council had agreed to share any relevant information or discoveries with the SMV Council immediately, and that info would then be passed to Julius as a matter of urgency. By the end, a precarious alliance had been forged. Many of the details of the alliance would be hammered out over the next few days, the two sides needing to find ways to merge their forces and best utilize their unique strengths. Julius had made it clear that his werewolf contingent would follow the directions from both Gabby or Carl, if he ordered them to, but the vampires would only take orders from him or Alexander as his second-in-command. It was one of the few points he refused to elaborate on, and was moving on. The council had respected his decision, and had agreed to work around these issues. Phone numbers for Julius, Alexander, and Patrick were to be included on the emergency call list for any demon activity notifications from the SMV. And Julius would ensure that the vampires either helped or stayed out of the way when it came to cleaning up and limiting media coverage. Everyone agreed Byron was the master of those situations. As the meeting wrapped up, the vampires were the first to exit the building, leaving as a unit in a silent, fluid wave. Gabby said a quick goodbye to Byron and the other elders, promising to look after herself, and then headed for the far exit. Carl finished up his conversation with Alistair and Douglas and caught up with her just as she opened the door. The cool night air was crisp and refreshing. Gabby had always loved the night time, and tonight was the perfect evening for a run in the forest. She sighed as she realised the pack of vampires were standing at her car. No relaxing run in the forest for her. "We need to talk," Julius purred quietly, stepping out of the group as Gabby and Carl approached the car. Gabby eyed him a little warily. His voice sounded as though he was barely restraining his temper. "So talk," she said flatly, "but make it quick. Wolf and I are starving." As if to prove her point, her stomach grumbled loudly. She just barely held off the blush of embarrassment and gritted her teeth as stifled snorts and chuckles erupted from the group of vampires. The anger left Julius's face, and somehow managed not to crack a smile himself. "So it would seem," Julius agreed wryly. "We can talk after you and Carl have had dinner. Shall we meet you at your place again?" Gabby's embarrassment vanished instantly as annoyance surged through her. She definitely didn't need a whole pack of them invading her cherished privacy. "No," she growled, her tone brooking no argument. "Not my place." Then a thought occurred to her. "We can meet you at your place. Wolf and I will grab some food from a drive-thru, and then we can follow you to your domain." Julius looked like he was about to protest. "It would only be fair," she said innocently, "for us to know where you live, since you know where I live." She ended on a dangerous note, making it clear that she didn't like them having knowledge of her private details. Julius chewed the idea for a few moments before glancing at Alexander, who also paused before slowly nodding. "All right, but I do expect the two of you to keep the location to yourselves. What drive-thru do you want to stop by?" Gabby and Carl were making short work of a bag full of burgers and chips, washing them down with a large sugar-laden caffeinated energy drinks, when they drove up to the gates at the estate, as Julius called it. They were in one of the most affluent suburbs of the city, the place where celebrities and eccentric billionaires bought houses. They had already passed several vans emblazoned with the word security during slow patrols of the area. Apparently they weren't too concerned about the red Mustang tucked between one of the 4x4 SUVs and Julius's Aston Martin. She noticed all the security personnel they passed give the SUV a quick nod. "Whoa," Carl breathed in blatant admiration as they followed the SUV through the electronic gates and along the tree-lined driveway, lit every few meters by light to make it look like brass lanterns. By the light of the waxing moon, they could make out a number of cottages and bungalows set into a large copse of trees to the left, and a running track, tennis court, and swimming pool on their right. Then the trees opened up ahead, and they could see what could only be described as a mansion. "You didn't tell me his place was this spectacular," Carl said, awestruck. They drove around the rear of the main house and parked next to the SUV under an enclosed carport big enough for 10 cars. To their right was garaging for at least another 6 cars, and a ramp that looked like it led to an underground parking. "You're just easily impressed," Gabby drawled at him, hiding her own surprise at the sheer size and grandeur of the place. "Besides, I never saw the place last time I was here," she continued as she climbed out of the car. "I was taken in unconscious and brought out blindfolded," she growled, throwing Julius a disgruntled look, and slammed the car door shut. Patrick, Nathan, and Marcello took their leave, heading towards a large single-story building, partially hidden behind a thick hedge, after giving Julius short, respectful bows. Julius nodded at them and then moved towards a large, beautifully carved wooden door, opening it and waiting for Gabby and Carl to precede him into the house. "Welcome to my home," he said simply. "Perhaps I could prove to be a better host this time," he continued, giving Gabby a smile. She suddenly noticed his eyes had turned pitch black, the gold halo barely visible, and suppressed a nervous shiver. "Alexander," Julius called to the other vampire who was divesting himself of his jacket and short sword, "will you show our guests to the bar area while I tell Gregory we're here? I'll join you shortly." Before Gabby could blink, he was gone. Wordlessly and with a long-suffering expression on his face, Alexander led them through an impressive entrance hall, past a sweeping mahogany staircase, down a wide corridor hung with stunning paintings, and into a large open-air entertainment area, complete with a fully stocked bar, pool tables, and several comfy-looking sofas. Large glass panels slid back on 2 sides to completely open the room to a beautifully manicured garden, sporting a hot tub and barbecue grill. Gabby snorted in amusement. "Really? A barbecue? In a house full of vampires? You gotta be kidding me." Alexander looked up from pouring himself a bourbon from behind the bar. "Oh, is that what that thing's for?" he replied indifferently. "I guess the builder wasn't expecting to have vampires buy the place." He placed a bottle of red wine, 2 wine glasses, and a beer on the bar counter, added some ice to his own glass, and sprawled gracefully on one of the large sofas. Gabby walked back in from the garden and took the glass of wine Kyle had offered her. Kyle seemed content to grab his beer and collapse on another of the couches, but Gabby couldn't find it in her to settle down. Something was eating at her, keeping tension high. It seemed that Julius was taking a long time informing his clan members where they were. Alexander and Kyle started talking strategy. Alexander was grilling Kyle about fighting demons. She sipped her wine, savouring the taste. Lord and lady, it was an amazing wine. She thought idly about setting up the pool table, but the thought of her shoulder aching, and she decided against it. She was just about to slip out of the room and go exploring when Julius swept into the room. "My apologies for the delay," he said, not explaining himself further. He quickly checked that they all had something to drink before pouring himself a glass of wine. Gabby found herself marvelling at the change in him. It took her a few seconds to pinpoint the differences. The biggest change was in his eyes. They were back to being their deep sapphire pools rimmed in gold. Some of the tension was also gone from the muscles in his face and jaw. There was a healthier colour to him. It wasn't until she watched him open his mouth to take a sip of wine that she noticed the length of his canines, that it all suddenly made sense. Her breath caught in her chest as she made the connection. Her mind raced. She turned away from him quickly before she could see the expression on her face. Revulsion and horror warring with her natural, ruthless practicality. She knew how they lived, she knew what they had to do in order to survive, but her natural human instincts wanted to shy away from the idea. She wondered if perhaps he drank bag blood. That would make it a little easier for her to deal with. The thought of her drinking from a real-life person left her shuddering, but the thought of him drinking from a real-life, beautiful, warm female person sent a completely different spike of emotion through her. Was that actually a jab of jealousy? That last thought brought her up short, and brought her back into reality of the moment. She knew he was watching her, his unnerving, beautiful eyes boring into the side of her face. She suddenly wished her hair was loose so she could hide her face from him for a few moments longer, while she gathered her scattered wits. No one had spoken. Carl and Alexander had broken off from their discussion of various types of demons when they heard Gabby's intake of breath. It was as though they were all waiting for the bomb to go off. Carl obviously hadn't come to the same conclusion she had. He didn't look revolted or angry, just confused by the sudden tension in the air, and ready for anything. She took a deep, calming breath, wincing slightly as her ribs complained, and braced herself to face him. She was saved from saying anything as a stockily built, dark-haired man bustled in. He had 2 trays in his hands, one piled high with a variety of mouth-watering, decadent chocolates, and the other with a variety of savoury snacks. Though her vamp sense told Gabby that this was a fairly old vampire, he appeared to be somewhat nervous. While he deposited the trays on a low table in the centre of the sofas and bowed respectfully to Julius and Alex, he kept a wary eye on the non-vampires as they were large, unpredictable dogs. Gabrielle, Kyle. Julius inclined his head to them politely. This is Gregory. He is my steward here at the estate and takes care of all the day-to-day details of the place. If you can't reach me for any reason, you can always contact Gregory, and he will more than likely know how to contact me. He paused and turned to Gregory. Gregory, this is Gabrielle Bradford and Carl Robson. I want you to show them every respect while they are here at the estate. They are under my direct protection, and I need all of our staff to understand and respect that. There seemed to be a lot more said than the relative simple words he had spoken, as Gregory dipped his head somberly and spoke as though he was taking a vow. Yes, sire, I understand, sire. The staff shall be informed. He raised his eyes back to Julius, studiously ignoring Gabby and Carl. Is there anything else before I escort the young lady home, sire? See you next time. Bye.